week 10 of the fantasy football season. And here's a few wide receivers I'd look to get on the waiver wire this week. The first guy, Donovan People-Jones, Cleveland Browns. So Donovan People-Jones, he made an impact right away here with Odell Beckham finally out of town and released 2 catches, 86 yards, and a touchdown at Cincinnati. So People-Jones, he's a deep threat. He's definitely a playmaker. And like I mentioned in last week's video, as him as a sleeper option, he came through with a big ball game. And the last few games before he went out with injuries in Week 7 and 8. Week 5 at the Chargers, 5 catches, 70 yards. Week 6 versus the Cardinals, the best game of his career, 4 catches, 101 yards, and 2 touchdowns. And then Week 7 and 8, he missed time. But right now, with Beckham out of town, Landry definitely not 100%. He's definitely a deep ball threat as People-Jones, and he's an athletic wide receiver that can run the routes and make the plays as well. So right now, he's available in 88% of fantasy leagues, and there's no need to hold him back anymore in Cleveland with that opportunity coming up. And he showed it in Week 9, and in Week 10, he's got a pretty decent matchup in New England, and I think he can make some plays in that game as well. The next wide receiver I look to get on the wire this week is Adama Zaccheaus of the Atlanta Falcons. So Zaccheaus available in 99% of fantasy leagues. Had a big ball game in Week 9 at the Saints. 3 catches, 58 yards, and 2 touchdowns. I know a little fluky with the 2 touchdowns on 3 catches, but we've seen flashes from this guy last season and earlier this year. He had a decent game in Week 3 at the Giants. 3 catches, 32 yards, and a touchdown. So with Calvin Ridley at least out the next 3 ball games here for the Atlanta Falcons, someone has to step up. Russell Gage last week had a goose egg. This week he played better, was Gage, but Zaccheaus was the main wide receiver in this offense. So right here, more of a deeper league ad, no doubt about it in my opinion. But this week he'll get some attention on the wire and probably added 10 to 12% of leagues. But after coming off a 2-touchdown game and a great matchup in Week 10 at the Dallas Cowboys that give up the 8th most fantasy points to wide receivers, he's definitely a wide receiver I recommend this week. The next wide receiver is Elijah Moore of the New York Jets. Jet fans and fantasy owners were waiting patiently for Elijah Moore to break out and have a big ball game, and he finally did in Week 9 at the Indianapolis Colts. 7 catches, 84 yards, and 2 touchdowns. So a huge PPR fantasy day with 27 fantasy points. In the last 3 weeks now, he's had double-digit fantasy days, is Elijah Moore. Week 7 at the Patriots, he had 20 rushing yards and a touchdown and 1 catch for 13 yards. Week 8 versus the Bengals, 6 catches, 67 yards, and 4 rushing yards. And then the big game at Indianapolis, like I mentioned. So right here in Week 10, in my opinion, as long as Zach Wilson isn't going to come back, Josh Johnson and Mike White, they're getting the receivers the ball, and they look better, in my opinion, than Zach Wilson has this season so far. So right here, Elijah Moore's available in 73% of fantasy leagues. He's definitely a good playmaker on this Jet team, and he looks comfortable with these 2 other quarterbacks. So right here, I know it's a tough matchup in Week 10 versus Buffalo, but it's a ball game where they're going to be trailing early and often, most likely, and they're going to have to throw the football a ton. So I like Moore as a big pickup this week. The next wide receiver is Tim Patrick of the Denver Broncos. So I thought Patrick, he was going to be phased out of the offense now as the 3rd wide receiver over there in Denver with Jerry Jeudy back over the last few weeks. But Tim Patrick had a huge ball game versus the Dallas Cowboys after 2 down weeks in Week 7 and Week 8. So at the Cowboys, 4 catches, 85 yards, and a touchdown. But he definitely got nicked up in this ball game with his ankle rolling. But Week 10, a good matchup versus the Philadelphia Eagles, where we see wide receivers pretty much weekly have big games versus them. And right here in Week 10 at home versus them, I think Tim Patrick, if he plays in this game, can make an impact. We've seen him have good games, and Cortland Sutton just didn't get the job done in this game, so it was more Patrick and Jeudy. So right now, Patrick's available in 75% of fantasy leagues, and he's definitely an ad this weekend. The 5th and final wide receiver I'd look to get on the wire this week is Deontay Harris of the New Orleans Saints. Deontay Harris here, he's available in a whopping 85% of fantasy leagues, and he had a pretty decent PPR game in Week 9 versus the Falcons. 6 catches, 52 yards. And the news came out early last week that Michael Thomas, once again, he's going to be out for the season. And now Harris, he came off of injury after being injured in Week 7. So Week 8 versus Tampa Bay, he had the 3 catches, 35 yards, and 22 rushing yards. But Week 10 here, he's got a great matchup with the Tennessee Titans that give up the most fantasy points to to wide receivers. So I could see a big game out of Harris, no doubt about it. He's a speedy threat. Trevor Siemian, he's been pretty decent so far the first 2 times we've seen him. And him and Harris have a pretty decent rapport. So right here, I would give Harris an ad. So that's a few wide receivers I look to get on the waiver wire for week 10 of the fantasy football season.